This is the Fire Temple theme from Ocarina of Time, and it's become somewhat infamous. That's because it includes audio of some real Islamic chanting in the background. The story goes that when Muslim players heard this chanting in the game, they complained to Nintendo, and in later versions, that chanting was removed. Except the truth of the story is a little bit more complicated. So, in this video, I'm going to tell the true story of why Nintendo's developers included this out-of-place religious chanting in their game, and the actual reason Nintendo got rid of it in later versions. This is the story behind the most controversial Zelda song. So, this here is Koji Kondo. He's the man responsible for Ocarina of Time's phenomenal soundtrack. In 1995, he was given a huge job. Zelda's creator, Shigeru Miyamoto, said this at the time: "What I'd like to do is to create a totally realistic atmosphere. For example, if you went to a dungeon, you could almost smell it." Which sounded cool, sure, but how was Koji Kondo meant to go about achieving that? Well, he tried asking some of the people who were working on this new Zelda game for any ideas, but he didn't get very much in return. Kondo thought that maybe because those developers were younger and he was older, they were intimidated by him, and so didn't want to give him advice about how to do his job. But as Kondo explained, without that direction, it does make it hard for me to write. However, at the time, Koji Kondo had an interest in what's known as world music featuring traditional instruments from non-Western locations like Asia, Africa, or Latin America. And in Kyoto, the city where Nintendo is based, there was a shop that sold CDs of all different varieties, including this world music. According to Koji Kondo, "I recently found a CD shop where you can try out and listen to the CDs before buying, and I've been spending a lot of time in their folk music corner. I've been able to hear tons of things I've never heard before. I go there a lot." Now, while some of those CDs had actual songs on them, others had simple audio samples. For instance, a recording of some African drumming, or of some traditional folk singing. Or how about this Islamic chanting? So that chanting sound comes from a CD that Koji Kondo discovered, called Best Service Voice Spectral Volume 1. Now, this CD is absolutely full of interesting voice sounds, beatboxing, shouting, and unusual singing. But there's one sound on the CD which seems completely out of place: the Islamic chanting sound. Now, if you listen to the Arabic words that are being said here, it sounds like this audio sample was probably created by chopping up a few different Islamic religious chants and throwing them together in a way which sounds totally strange and messy to actual members of the religion. It starts with a phrase which translates to, "In the name of God, most gracious, most merciful." Then it recites 2 verses from the 112th chapter of the Quran. But it only gets halfway through that before it cuts to a totally different phrase, Allahu Akbar, which means God is the greatest. So, in other words, this recording cuts between a couple of different, mostly unrelated phrases in Arabic. And so, to most Muslims, this audio sample sounds, well, a little bit silly. But to Koji Kondo, it was just foreign chanting, and he liked the sound of this foreign chanting a lot. So much so that he decided to use it as a part of Ocarina of Time. Kondo said in an interview that he'd actually been wanting to do a song with some kind of chanting in it for a long time, so it worked out perfectly. When he came to create the music for Ocarina of Time's Fire Temple, he decided to write a whole piece of music around this Islamic chanting sample, and the final result was this. And so, during November of 1998, Ocarina of Time was released for the Nintendo 64. And when players entered the Fire Temple, they heard Koji Kondo's composition, chanting and all. At least, they did if they bought the game as soon as it was released. However, if they waited any longer to buy it, then they would hear a slightly different version of the Fire Temple theme, which sounded like this. The real recording of Arabic chanting was replaced by a synthesized choir sound instead. So, what's going on here? Well, you see, there were actually 5 slightly different versions of Ocarina of Time released for the N64. These different ROMs, as they're called, can be split into 2 regions, NTSC, which covers Japan and North America, and PAL, which covers Europe and Australia. Each subsequent version of the ROM contains fixes for bugs that Nintendo found in the game, along with other minor changes. So, how does this affect the Fire Temple? Well, if we put the different versions of Ocarina of Time's ROM in the order that they were built, then we can draw a definitive line here, where Nintendo decided to change the music of the Fire Temple. NTSC 1.0 and 1.1 both feature the recording of the Islamic chant, while PAL 1.0 and all versions following it instead feature the synthesized choir, and re-releases of the game for GameCube, Virtual Console, and 3DS are also all based on later versions of the ROM, so none of them feature the Islamic chanting either. So, why'd Nintendo get rid of it? Well, the obvious answer is this. The chanting was offensive to Muslims. I asked a few of my Muslim viewers for more details on that. So, there's a few reasons why featuring this chant in the game is kind of offensive, or at least pretty distasteful. The obvious one is that the Quran is a sacred book. Using its words as set dressing, essentially, to set a creepy mood for the game is just in poor taste. But there's other reasons. The recording cuts off a chapter of the Quran halfway through, which is seen as inappropriate. Plus, many Muslims believe that music itself is haram, or forbidden, in the Islamic faith. Now, religious chanting isn't necessarily considered music, which is why it's okay. But setting those chants to a musical beat is definitely music, and therefore it breaks this pretty fundamental rule. And now, the question of whether music is or is not haram is a hotly debated one, and it's not one that every Muslim will agree upon. But I think it's pretty clear now that the chanting in the Fire Temple is, at best, going to be uncomfortable to hear for a lot of Muslim gamers. Except, none of that matters. I don't mean it doesn't matter that the chanting is offensive. I think it's bad, obviously, to use passages from a sacred religious book in a way that will upset people of that religion. No, what I mean is that backlash from Muslim players is not the reason Nintendo changed the chanting. If I bring back the different versions of Ocarina of Time's ROM, take a closer look at the date that these different ROMs were built or finalized. Every single one of those dates is from before the game was even released. In other words, Nintendo printed those early batches of Ocarina of Time cartridges, then they decided to change the chanting, and then printed another batch of cartridges, all before the game was released at all. So backlash from Islamic gamers can have nothing to do with it. So what was the real reason? Well, an old copy of the official Nintendo magazine, Nintendo Power, might hold a clue to the answer. A reader wrote in with the following question: "Something's bothering me. I recently bought Ocarina of Time, and the music in the Fire Temple is different in my friend's version. There's a choir in his version, but in mine it's not there. It's really freaking me out." And here's what the magazine replied with. The original release of Ocarina of Time did have choir music in the Fire Temple, but it was removed from later versions. The mysterious Fire Temple choir music resembled a holy Muslim chant. And while, of course, the game's creators didn't intend for that to happen, it was similar enough that Nintendo changed the music. And then, years later, in 2013, game news website Game Trailers received a more detailed response from Nintendo of America. In regard to your question, the background sound effects originally used in the Fire Temple section of The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time were originally chosen from a library of commercially available musical and sound effect programs. Our game developers did not know that the sounds used in the game had Islamic references. Once we were informed that there were Islamic musical references in this section of the game, the music was removed from all subsequent production runs of The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. So, in other words, Koji Kondo likely had no idea what the meaning of the chanting on his sample CD actually was when he included it in the Fire Temple's music. He just liked the sound of it. And presumably, as Nintendo was going through the testing phase before Ocarina of Time's release, someone inside the company, or someone who playtested the game, noticed that this chanting wasn't just some generic vocal music, but instead an Islamic religious chant. And so, to avoid causing offense to players, Kondo rewrote the Fire Temple theme, replacing the real vocal recording with a synthesized vocal line instead. However, this change was made close enough to the game's release that early copies of the game were printed before that music was changed. Except there's one last wrinkle to the story. Because the Islamic chant recording is actually still included within Ocarina of Time's soundtrack, even in the game's modern re-releases. It's just very, very difficult to hear. You might have to take my word for this next part a little. So this is the Shadow Temple theme, another temple theme that features choir-like singing. However, it's not this singing sound we have to pay attention to. Instead, just around the 1 minute mark of the song, there's a strange background noise which plays a few times. I'll highlight when the sound is playing, so hopefully you'll be able to pick out the sound I'm talking about. Now, that sound doesn't really sound like anything in particular, it's just a strange discordant noise. But if you dig through Ocarina of Time's files, it turns out this strange noise is actually that very same Islamic chant recording, just chopped up and played in a few close clashing chord formations. Here's a recreation of the sound, isolated from the backing track. So, because that strange noise isn't recognizable as religious chanting, Nintendo never removed it from the Shadow Temple theme. Either Koji Kondo forgot to remove it, or more likely, he just decided it didn't matter, since no one on Earth could recognize this as religious chanting. And so because of that, the Islamic chant sound is still included within Ocarina of Time's soundtrack, in one form or another, even in the most modern re-releases. So next time you're playing Ocarina of Time, take a close listen to the music from these two temples, the Fire Temple and the Shadow Temple, because now you know the interesting history behind the music featured inside them. Hey, thanks for watching, and thanks so much to all of the very kind Muslim viewers on Twitter who helped fill me in on the significance of this particular chanting. If you're interested in more Zelda videos, check out a video I made called Who Are Link's Parents?, exploring a very mysterious part of Link's backstory. I think you'll enjoy it.